Hey y'all. I just kind of want to give, before I move on to Simone, I kind of want to give a couple last minute thoughts on Sartre, absurdity, bad faith, um, specifically, and obviously freedom, right? I mean, that's what we get from Sartre, right? That's our freedom, homie, right? And so for him, existentialism is a sort of an ideology or a philosophy that recognizes that a person is free to decide how they want to live their life. You know, um, one is in charge of one's self. One is a captain of their own sail, if you will. So obviously, we know to Sartre there are two types of reality. Just kind of in sum, just as I'm thinking about the link to Simone. So there's two types of reality. There's the existence in itself, right? And then there's existence for itself, right? We remember that if something exists in itself, it's because it simply is, right? It doesn't have to live consciously for itself. It is the object of what consciousness sees, right? So an example is your phone, right? Or the screen of your phone, right? It's a screen, right? It is a screen. This is what it is, and it doesn't have consciousness to see itself as a screen and be happy about being a phone or whatever, or even think about other things it can be, right? Other than a screen, it just is what it is, right? It exists in itself as what it is, right? So that's one thing with Sartre. The other thing is something exists for itself, then it has a sense of consciousness, has choice, right? A desire to be, right? And not defined, predefined, um, predestined, if you will. It sets its own course, right? And I think, right, for me, one of the things when I think of Simone, right, I think it ties kind of nicely, to her at least the second sex, right? I think, and I'll just kind of touch briefly on it here before I finish Sartre. I think, for Simone, man is like the superhero, right? Man is it, right? And woman is subordinate, right? Man is centered. Women are periphery. And again, we're talking about, early 19th century, early 20th century, late 19th century. But again, Simone's theory or conversation, which is early feminist, we'll talk about that in a second, but man is always the subject then, right, as being centered, and women are always the object, right? And sort of in a philosophical sense, the subject has identity, right? The subject exists on its own, apart from the context that it's in. It simply exists. It is, right? The man is, in a sense, right? The object is dependent then upon the subject, right? This is how, the biblical folk get to acting all kind of old school, talking about a woman is pulled from what? The rib of a man, right? So the object is dependent upon the subject, right? The object is to be observed, right? Maybe even objectified. Object objectified, right? The subject is what? The observer, right? This is Simone's work, even before we thinking about some of the stuff in the 20th and 21st century, late 20th, 21st century. Again, quick thing before I move in, man, is subject, woman is object, and it's kind of the bottom line of the second sex, right? And so when we think about woman as other, her Simone jumped in there and sort of that's how she kind of got her bones, right? It's one of the first attempts at feminism in 1940s. As she tries to say, look, we see man as this absolute and essential being, right? And women is as inessential or incomplete, it sort of gives authority, right, to man to enforce his will, right? Think about, well, we're talking, I don't know, to enforce his will, and women have to be bound by the circumstances, right? Again, man as subject, women as object. So we'll get back to that in a minute. Of course, when we have our classroom discussions, I look forward to it. But back to Sartre, the other point, obviously, freedom. The other point is absurdity, right? As humans, we've kind of traded in the reality of existence for ourselves for a life of existence in ourselves, right? Another way of looking at it, we think about money, or even governments, right? Sometimes even religions turn us into objects rather than living a life of free choice and possibility. We are just sort of looked at sort of others, right? Basically having to regurgitate that which we learn or that which we have been programmed to learn, right? And then to repeat, right? I get this all the time, even now running for office. You get these conversations. I'm like, do you have a thought of your own, right? Do you understand confluence? Or anyway. But Sartre, right, and a lot of those who come before, obviously the bottom line of this course is about absolute freedom to sort of choose, and that is what makes us human. It makes us special in a certain sense, right? And so we must take freedom, right, and grab it, especially away from absurdity, right? And of course, remember absurdity, the idea that things must be as they are simply because, they are, right? It's just like, you need to kind of seize that for a minute. In Being in Nothingness, remember Sartre used the story of the waiter you all should have read by now. Well, definitely, I know you read by now. Obviously, while observing the waiter, the Sartre was kind of upset that the waiter just taking his job way too seriously. The waiter then, walked kind of harshly, stood, kind of, virally, and spoke just perfect to his customers, right? He schmoozed, he kind of placated, he kind of played the role, right? And Sartre, it made him think that, the waiter was more waiter than human. The girlfriend was more girlfriend than human. The student was more student than human. Playing the role. He let his job, he let his position, he let his circumstance, and in the case of the waiter, the money that he got from that, turn into the object, turn him into an object. That was what? Doing a job, right? As opposed to a person that has a job, right? Lost his freedom, lost possibility, right? Any authenticity. Gave it up for what? Excuse me. Gave it up for what? An apron and a pad to write your order down, right? And then obviously you use the example of the waiter to talk about bad faith, right? That we've all traded in life. What he talked about as bad faith. Bad faith is the belief that things have to be a certain way, and we are victims to circumstance rather than a sort of a conqueror of the circumstance with freedom, with consciousness. And so thus Sartre sort of holds on to the position that we're just stuck in anguish, right? And anguish is caused, we should be stuck in anguish. Anguish is caused by the truth of the matter that we are free and free to choose. All right, so thinking more to Simone for about 15 minutes. I'll probably begin a little bit here with the little bit of historical and personal context, and then obviously talk about the existential themes in her works. She has three major sort of works. She has a long essay in one of Sartre's manuscripts, Existentialism as Popular Wisdom. Obviously, her magnum corpus, that's not right, magnum opus, excuse me, magnum corpus, is the Second Sex, right? And then the Ethics of Ambiguity, right? So you'll be bringing a little bit from both those, right? Obviously, I'm going to deal with the Second Sex a little bit and the Ethics of Ambiguity a little bit as well. So yeah. So basically, I think she died in 1986, right? She was clearly one of the leading intellectual figures. She was born in like the late 1800s. Had a profound effect on many social issues, not just feminism, but certainly one of the precursors of what we call academic, sort of form of feminism. But yeah, but also we think about people like Mary Wollstonecraft, like that. But she has many sort of diverse interests, though, right? Because those of you already know, she's friends with Camus and Sartre. So literature, politics, certainly when she's in it. Obviously, ethics is something she's also engaged in, and so she was very active, right, in the academy and in the hood, if you will, right? And so that's important to know. This thing called this existentialism, if you will, was part and parcel of everything that she engaged in, of her interests and her skill sets, but it wasn't all of it, right? But as an existentialist, right, she has some foundational and powerful insights that, especially when it comes to the feminist movement. We talked about before, I sent you a video, her lifelong relationship with Sartre is well known and documented. I have a big book in my office, called Letters to Simone from Sartre, and a very interesting read. As a philosopher, as an existentialist, male-dominated kind of space, at least back then, we kind of have to be careful to make sure we see Simone as Simone and not just as the dear friend of the great Jean-Paul Sartre. And it might not be easy sometimes because they share a lot of thoughts and ideas together, right? And so, but I'll try a little bit here in the next few minutes to sort of, balance the contrasting and linking, right? While we understand, Simone has her own kind of thoughts and contributions. So the essay that I mentioned that she had in Sartre's piece, the Existentialism and Popular Wisdom, in Sartre's journal, it wasn't as known, obviously, as Sartre's Existentialism of Humanism and Humanism. But in that, she sort of gives her own account and analysis of what existentialism is, and slightly, even before Sartre does his, right? And maybe you can say it's a stronger case, as it recognizes philosophy and freedom as bound together, both as a lived experience phenomenologically, but also theoretically. And this is how it should be if one is to be more honest and objective in what they do. Similar to Sartre, though, you know, the definition of existentialism for her, like other sort of disciplines, um, you know, sort of, you know, she rejects, you know, a lot of these big systems and tails and, you know, things like that. But um, I think for her, and for even the people I talked to today, like even some students like of yours, right? Some colleagues of yours, one of the hardest things to think about to take existentialism seriously is that it's heavy, right? And it demands self-reflection. It demands responsibility and owning your responsibility, both for the individual and for the society that the individual is in. And for some people, that's just too much responsibility, right? And and Simone says, nah, there needs to be some love there. There needs to be some love in embracing, responsibility, right? I know it's hard, but it's better for folk if you take your personal responsibility seriously. And so in this case, as a philosophy of freedom, if you will, I think we should, especially thinking about Simone's work, we should see it not as an arduous task, as Sartre might call it, in anguish, but it is one that we need to be optimistic and creative in doing. So it's not just about despair, it's about possibility, right? I like that. I like to use that sometimes. That what I do is not about a despair, but it's about possibility through self-reflection, right? Obviously, in the vein of existence precedes essence, humans are not naturally good or bad to Simone. They're not naturally happy or sad to Simone, in part because, you know, the individual is nothing at the beginning, right? There's nothing going on, you know. In her Second Sex, book, um, which is a very, very important book. Hard to explain, partly because not I should use it as an excuse, but I'm not a feminist, so I read it maybe a little different than what feminists do. But I am, in a sense, a postmodernist, so I understand that, there are positionalities that people must take, and we should take in terms of understanding one's phenomenological position. But so I'm very respectful to the tradition, and I know that it has real significant influence and gravitas even on its own, right? Obviously, a lasting and profound legacy, right? And so the Second Sex first obviously appeared in French, right? Two different volumes, and I think it was translated in English, right? Some people criticized it as being a bad translation, a sexist translation, and then it was only translated again in 2009. That's the one that I use mostly um, once I kind of read some of the criticisms of it. Um, but nevertheless, sort of given the poor translation, the Second Sex has had massive influence on us in America and those who do this kind of work. Um, so maybe let's try this. If we think about um, sort of the key to understanding her work, um, look at the insight and complexity of the human sexual experience, right? Which has not really been not been significantly emphasized, but anyway, I know I'm digressing. I was about to digress, but I'm not. So let's think about this. If we think about the fact that she doesn't really do the sex gender distinction that has been, and even today is somehow wanting to hold on to sort of this mainstream use, male, female, boy, girl kind of stuff. They did not use gender in this work, right? So one way to look at this is um, sort of the most basic when Beauvoir speaks of women, um, you know, from their position, and you know, she's speaking of it from an empirical perspective, right, and looking at the ways in which men see her, right, and other women in our everyday lives. So it's kind of her feminism or her second sex is kind of a phenomenological text, right, and is obvious to us, sort of phenomenologically as we look out into the world, quote unquote, who is a man, who is a woman. Though obviously, with queer culture, in our day, those binaries become more fluid. But that's the first thing. Second, obviously, the difference between, the female and male kind of the model of a female, the model of a male. There's this biological distinction, clearly based on sort of factual data, like, what kind of reproductive organs that you got, right? But it doesn't exclude the possibility of third or other categories, right? Non-sexual, intersexual, whatever. Um, and so, a lot more work has been done lately on that and psychologically on that. I'm not a scholar on that area, but certainly she wants to look beyond the binary, right? Obviously, and the difference between the masculine and the feminine as social constructions, right? Um, and seeing the feminine in the masculine, and seeing the masculine in the feminine. You know what I'm saying, right? And so, what we kind of know now is gender roles, psychological, social, cultural aspect of one's sex. That's what we're kind of talking about, right? And so I think her um, influence can spill into sort of other categories, right? An individual can and usually does have both feminine and masculine traits sometimes. Um, um, you know, that's just kind of what it is. And so these are the concepts of what it is to be women and men, and they're used into the singular. This is a man, this is a woman with definite, with definite kind of roles. And obviously, we know that these can change over time, as they have from her writing to now. But we also know that, we can be greatly and, conditioned culturally with these concepts, even among changes. So that's why even in the House of Congress, you got folk fighting and arguing about, these type of conceptions. You have campuses kind of trying to be, non-binary and have, non-gender specific bathrooms or locker rooms or things like that, right? So it's kind of broke. The book is kind of broke down. A couple volumes, right? Facts and myths. In that section, she has an analysis to show how many facts, for example, being able to have children or not being able to have children, create powerful myths, right? To sort of keep women in that particular gendered class subjugated, right? And so the idea of destiny then, right, is an analysis of how patriarchy gets engaged and gets involved and has created certain destinies for women, on the biological, psychological, and economic levels, right? Um, you know, I could think like psychologically, economically, theories and systems that have been used to sort of sustain women in their sort of secondary roles, right? Uh, with regard primarily to biology, right? It's sort of a widespread argument that women are ultimately wombs, right? Carriers of children, right? And they're, in many cases, they're defined by their ability to have or don't have children, right? Of course, Beauvoir is trying to fight up against this, right? And how this question of choice again comes in, this freedom, how I can choose to have children in an equal balanced society, but they don't need to be complete, right? And we still deal with that today. Women who struggle over their ability or inability to have children and what that says about them, especially among parents or grandparents who, when you gonna have some kids, stuff like that, right? And so some of these destinies, if you will, these teleos, these ends of womanhood, oftentimes suffocate the freedom that a woman has to make for her own life. And so for Simone, these sort of existential choices, are things that are precious and must be held sacred. Um, she also, in Second Sex, gives, in another part of that volume, she kind of gives a historical explanation of how this situation has come about, back to pre-civilized days. She has a section called Myths, right, and the falsehoods and illusions that men have typically and historically written about women in literature and stuff like that. And so the first volume, if you will, um, provides a comprehensive and critical historical account of sexism, right, showing that a lot of it tried to deny the fundamental existential insight that that women have for themselves, and the insight that we have been conditioned to hold as men, right? And these myths are often fabricated and highly damaging to destiny, to authenticity, and to a sense of possibility, right? And so thinking about that, sort of open up to sort of logical and existential explanations in the second volume of the second sex. That the second volume is sort of this concrete phenomenology. She's kind of guided, undergirded by sort of a clear and consistent line of thought, a thesis that it sort of analyzes, sort of the various stage of being a female, the stages of being a woman, in vivid and honest detail. Um, the opening chapter, the view, we talk about that in class, I know. But, ultimately it boils down to there is no fixed essence or destiny of being or becoming a woman. Right, here's where she aligns herself with Sartre even more. This idea of this irradical, ir, in, ir, sort of an inescapable or irreducible freedom that a person has, even if we look at this as sort of downtrodden and abuse case of women, because it still is essentially and structurally has never kind of disappeared from our civilization, even in 2021. Patriarchy is still here, even though we fight up against it. It often successfully convinces both men and women of fixed natures, what a woman should do, what a man should do in their predestined spaces and places, right? Simone's sort of position tries to disprove that, right? As she sort of engages in concrete descriptions, sort of, especially as you think about it now in society, but even then, of how the odds are pretty much stacked against women in terms of equality anyway, right? And so this idea of the female body, right, the ontology, the sort of the body as gaze, stuff like that. The experience of body within the woman's experience of the body, as well as the man's experience of the woman's body from the outside in kind of thing. And here's where I think she makes her most salient and most important point, that men objectify women. Certainly in my life, I've had to reconcile and deal with some of this stuff, right? And Simone has been important to that. Men sort of have had the privilege of a certain way to assume their own positionality, and even language sometimes, uh, um, you know, think about how many times we've read in history the word man when they're talking about universal categories of humanity. Where's the woman? Right? Man does this, man does that. Right? So, obviously, for the feminists, for those who kind of see this, spend time looking at how this sort of plays out. Um, Marginalized women um, are kind of, wholesale, it's wholesale ways, um, are systematically, institutionally punished for being a woman, and Simone's work speaks to that. Um, but it's not too late, right? We know it's not too late now, but to Simone, it wasn't too late, and they can reclaim their subjectivity back from suppression, gain independence, and reestablish themselves as a social, ethical, and psychological hero, if you will. And so the idea of second wave feminism, comes from trying to take on this sort of reclamation project, right? And so, quickly, the ethics of ambiguity. I've said this before. I kind of close this. It's getting a little long now. One of the main points in the ethics of ambiguity is that our human reality is inherently ambiguous, right? Human reality is sort of almost a balancing act between freedom, and sort of this extreme of bad faith, right? And Simone kind of stresses further and constructs a whole ethics out of that, and makes it more detailed and systematic. She argues that, that we're always in dynamics between, subject object, right? Present, future, that kind of thing, right? And a good existential ethic does not need to embrace, the sort of the polarities, the Manichaean polarities, or does need to embrace it and not to run from it, I should probably say. So the ethics of ambiguity then is to accept and embrace the work that's necessary for us to be whole, right? And that then is a dynamic and active blend of opposing phenomena, right? And which is a little bit different than Sartre, but in essence, she had a very busy and productive life intellectually, personally, socially. Left some real strong footprints in the sand for those who followed her. Obviously she's come under criticism a lot, as all good writers and thinkers have. But if we boil her down to anything, it was equality, right? And equality is a central place for reason, which is why I do appreciate the work that she does, right? And if we can try to develop some type of existential ethic, then, I think people like Sartre and others, they kind of have to struggle to do the same, right? And so her phenomenology, her feminism, made her not only an invaluable thinker, but history of thought and ideas, So that's it. I look forward to seeing y'all in class on Tuesday. Hope this helps a little bit. Take care.